The sun was merciless at noon, flooding the supermarket parking lot with a glare so sharp it seemed to carve shadows into the asphalt. People moved in fragments, shopping carts rattling, children whining for candy, the casual rhythm of a town that thought itself safe. And then, without warning, that rhythm snapped. A patrol car rolled in slow, deliberate, the kind of slow that promised trouble, not safety. The officer stepped out first. His boots struck the ground with a finality that made heads turn. Behind him, the canine strained at the leash, claws tapping like nails on glass, a growl bubbling from deep inside its chest. It wasn't sniffing. It wasn't searching. Its eyes locked, unblinking, on a single figure at the entrance. A woman, black, mid-30s. She wasn't running. She wasn't even moving. She was holding a grocery bag against her hip, standing under the glare of the automatic doors that slid open and closed as if undecided whether to let her escape or keep her framed in that rectangle of light. The crowd felt it before they understood it. Something was wrong. Phones came up, hesitant, as if the cameras themselves were nervous. The officer's voice cut through the air, hard, commanding, "On the ground, now!" No context, no reason, just an order heavy with the weight of authority. The woman turned, slow, deliberate, her face calm in a way that didn't fit the moment. She said nothing. That silence was an insult, and everyone could feel it. The officer's jaw tightened. His hand twitched. The leash loosened. The dog launched. The bark shattered the air, ricocheting off car windows, making children cry. Teeth met fabric, then flesh, the sound of cotton tearing under the violence of jaws designed for submission. She staggered, knees buckling, groceries spilling, fruit rolling across the hot pavement like fleeing witnesses. The crowd gasped, but no one moved forward. Not a single hand reached out. The officer's grin spread, slow and cruel, as if this were not an arrest but a performance. He leaned close enough that only the front row could hear. "Nobody's coming to help you." And in that instant, under the white blaze of daylight, it looked true. She was alone, pinned, bleeding, humiliated before strangers who preferred their screens to their courage. But her eyes, steady, unflinching, betrayed something the officer did not see. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't begging. She was memorizing. Every bark, every insult, every drop of blood staining the pavement was being recorded somewhere deeper than any camera. He thought he was breaking her. He didn't know he was building a case against himself, a trap set the moment he chose her, here, in the open sun. What everyone believed was the end of her freedom was, in truth, the first fracture in his. The dog's growl still echoed in the parking lot long after the handler yanked it back, its jaws wet with the trace of someone who had not even lifted a hand against him. The woman's sleeve hung shredded, her groceries scattered like evidence of a life that had been violently interrupted. The crowd whispered, a low tide of judgment and fear, but no one dared break the line between watching and acting. The officer stood taller now, chest puffed with the kind of authority that feeds on silence, already preparing the story he would later file in his report, resisting arrest, suspicious behavior, a threat neutralized. And yet the truth was simpler. She had done nothing. She was an ordinary citizen leaving an ordinary store on an ordinary day, but for him, that was never enough. In places like this, reputation was less about facts and more about control. The town was small, the police were powerful, and history carried a long shadow of racial profiling that everyone knew existed but few would admit aloud. What had just unfolded was not a sudden mistake, but a symptom of something older, rooted deep in a system that had let too many officers cross too many lines without consequence. The woman remained silent, even as the pain throbbed through her arm. Her calm was not compliance. It was a strategy. She had learned long ago that words spoken in the wrong moment could be twisted, reshaped, and written down in reports that would be impossible to erase. Every second she stayed quiet was a refusal to hand him more ammunition. Around them, the crowd became part of the scene without realizing it. A teenager kept his phone aimed steadily, live streaming to followers who had tuned in expecting entertainment, but were now catching a glimpse of something raw, something that reeked of injustice. A mother clutched her child's hand and whispered that they should leave, but her eyes lingered with the guilt of knowing she wouldn't intervene. A man in a suit shook his head as if the sight disgusted him, but when asked later, he would claim he hadn't seen clearly, that the woman had looked aggressive. This is how police misconduct survives, not just through the actions of those in uniform, but through the indifference of the public. The officer's partner arrived minutes later, his cruiser pulling up with a screech. He didn't question the scene, he reinforced it. His first words not directed at the bleeding woman, but at the handler. "Good call." Their unity was unspoken, practiced, a performance rehearsed too many times. Together, they closed the circle, pushing her back against the hood of the car, demanding ID, barking accusations she never had the chance to answer. The bodycam footage, when reviewed later, would tell one story, edited by angle and perspective, but the raw clips recorded by bystanders said another. A black woman standing still, then mauled, then restrained, with nothing resembling resistance. That conflict between official narrative and lived reality was the oldest trick in the book, one that courts had seen before, one that civil rights attorneys had spent decades fighting to expose. She knew this, and that was why her silence mattered. She wasn't just surviving, she was calculating. Every detail, every insult, every command screamed at her in broad daylight was fuel, evidence, ammunition for something bigger than this parking lot. The officer believed he was stamping out a threat. What he didn't realize was that he was helping build a case that would reach far beyond his badge. The town thought it was watching a routine arrest. In truth, it was watching the opening act of a story that would soon demand national attention. The handcuffs closed around her wrists with a snap that echoed louder than the dog's bark, metal against bone, a sound that always carried the weight of guilt, even when there was none. The officer shoved her forward, pressing her against the cruiser's hood, and in that moment, the reflection in the windshield revealed more than the scene itself. Her face, calm, bleeding, but unbroken. He thought he was pinning down a criminal. She knew he was pinning down his career. People muttered from the sidelines, but their voices lacked conviction. One woman whispered, "She must have done something," as if needing an excuse to justify silence. A man in a baseball cap pulled his child away, shaking his head not at the injustice, but at the inconvenience. This was the machinery of racial profiling at work, invisible until it wasn't, and now laid bare under the sun for everyone to see. The partner rifled through her bag, groceries spilling onto the pavement, an apple rolling under a car, a receipt fluttering in the breeze. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious, yet he shook his head with theatrical dismay and muttered, "Resisting arrest," loud enough for the crowd to hear. That phrase, once written in a report, could become fact, and fact was often all a jury needed. She didn't speak. Not when they searched her, not when they accused her, not when the dog lunged again as if eager for another taste. Her silence was not weakness. It was evidence gathering. In the background, a teenager's live stream picked up speed, comments flooding in, strangers typing words like police abuse and civil rights violation, a digital chorus that the officers couldn't silence with handcuffs. But in the physical world, she remained trapped in a town where justice tilted heavily toward the badge. Inside the station, the game continued. The walls smelled of bleach and old paper, the kind of place designed to wear people down. They pushed her into a chair, barked questions, shoved forms in front of her, demanding signatures that would amount to confessions. A local prosecutor stepped in, sleeves rolled, voice thick with confidence. He spoke not like a seeker of truth, but like an ally of the officers, already framing the story as if it were finished. An unruly woman, a necessary use of force, case closed. Yet behind her stillness lay history. Years of watching these same tactics play out. Years of studying how wrongful arrest and police misconduct could be dismantled when documented with precision. Every insult hurled at her, every false accusation spoken in that sterile room, she stored like files in a cabinet, neat, organized, ready to be retrieved. She had promised herself long ago that when the system came for her, she would not flinch, she would not rage, she would not give them a single frame to twist. And so she sat there, wrists cuffed, blood drying on her sleeve, eyes steady under the fluorescent lights, while the men in uniform convinced themselves they had won. What they didn't realize was that the walls themselves were beginning to betray them. Bystander clips circulating online, questions rising, contradictions forming. The trap they thought they had closed around her was tightening instead around them, link by link, lie by lie, under the same daylight that had first exposed their arrogance. The holding cell smelled of rust and sweat, the kind of place meant to convince people that time itself had stopped. She sat on the metal bench, wrists marked from the cuffs, back straight as if she were waiting for a meeting rather than serving as the centerpiece of a police report. The officers outside the bars whispered, laughing in short bursts, their confidence thick, their words dripping with certainty. They had done this before. They had written stories that erased truth before it could ever reach daylight. They thought they were untouchable. The first climax rose when the officer who handled the K-9 typed his report with theatrical speed, words like resisting arrest, aggressive behavior, public disturbance, sliding across the page as if they were facts instead of inventions. He knew those words could live forever in the database, shaping perception long after the wounds healed. To him, paperwork was more powerful than the bite of his dog. But he didn't notice the teenager's live stream gaining thousands of views. The clip replayed frame by strangers who knew how to spot lies. That was the first fracture, reality splitting between official record and undeniable footage. The second climax came when the prosecutor leaned in, pressing her for a confession. He painted pictures of long trials, heavy fines, and jail time. His tone was casual, rehearsed, the way men speak when they believe they're writing history instead of fabricating it. He promised leniency if she admitted fault, suggesting things could go away quietly. His mistake was not realizing her silence wasn't fear. It was strategy. Every sentence he spoke became part of the trap he was building for himself. The third climax unfolded when the crowd outside began to stir. Local reporters, tipped off by the viral clips, arrived at the precinct. Their cameras caught the dog handler grinning for colleagues, captured officers joking near the cell. This was no longer just a case. It was a theater unfolding under the harshest critic, public opinion. Inside, the officers doubled down, insisting she was violent, dangerous. Outside, the footage told a story of a woman standing still, attacked without cause. The gap widened. The fourth climax erupted when an older officer, a veteran of the department, pulled the handler aside, whispering about the heat this case could bring. His voice cracked with unease. But arrogance is contagious. The handler scoffed, insisting the department had protected worse. He didn't see the younger recruits shifting uncomfortably, glancing at their body cams, knowing the footage was less forgiving than his memory. The system that had shielded them was no longer airtight. The fifth climax struck when the woman was dragged into interrogation under bright lights. They accused her of theft, of assault, of everything but breathing wrong. She responded only with silence, letting them fill the air with contradictions. One officer claimed she swung first, another said she shouted threats. Their lies tangled, threads crossing until the pattern collapsed. Even the prosecutor frowned at the inconsistencies. Truth was slipping through their fingers. The sixth climax pulsed online. Civil rights attorneys began commenting on the livestream clips, calling it textbook racial profiling, police misconduct captured in real time. Hashtags surged. The department's phone lines jammed. Calls from Washington buzzed unanswered. The officers inside pretended nothing was happening, but their glances at vibrating phones betrayed nerves. For the first time, the fortress felt fragile. The seventh climax broke when the local sheriff stormed in, face red, barking orders. He demanded silence, demanded loyalty, demanded that every officer write reports identical to the handlers. It was a desperate attempt at control. But unity forged in fear cracks easily. Some officers hesitated, pens hovering above paper, unwilling to commit perjury that could ruin careers. Whispers spread. A storm was coming, and loyalty no longer seemed safe. The eighth climax unfolded in the cell block as a fellow detainee, a man hardened by too many nights behind those bars, leaned toward her and muttered, "They're scared. I've never seen them like this." It was true. Fear was creeping into the corridors, dripping like water through cracked walls. The handler paced, the prosecutor raised his voice, the sheriff slammed his fists, but the tide outside was rising faster than they could contain. The ninth climax burned into the night when the first journalist aired the clip on national television. Anchors called it bodycam footage that raises questions of abuse of power. Analysts dissected the frame where the leash was clearly slack before the order to release. The country saw not a threat subdued, but a citizen brutalized. Pressure mounted. Civil rights investigation became more than a phrase. It became a promise. The 10th climax shattered illusions when a federal call finally broke through, not to the sheriff, not to the prosecutor, but directly to the precinct's captain. The voice on the other end was cold, official, carrying the weight of oversight no badge could deflect. Files were requested, videos demanded. The captain's face drained as he realized this was no longer a local matter. What had begun as a spectacle in a parking lot had become a national reckoning. And through it all, the woman remained steady, her silence more deafening than screams, her presence a mirror that forced every lie, every act of brutality, into the light. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't lifted her hand, yet she had turned a police station into a collapsing stage where the actors no longer remembered their lines. They had unleashed a dog on her, but in truth, they had unleashed something far more dangerous. Accountability that spread like wildfire, unstoppable under the noon sun. The precinct that once echoed with laughter now sat in brittle silence, the kind that made every cough, every shuffle of boots sound like an alarm. The officers were no longer smirking. Their jokes had dried up as quickly as the ink on the false reports stacked on the desk. The sheriff barked orders louder, but volume could not patch the cracks in a collapsing wall. They had written themselves into a corner, and the corner was closing fast. The twist came not in a shout, but in the quiet click of a door unlocking. A woman in a dark suit entered, carrying no weapon but the weight of federal authority. She wasn't there to visit a detainee. She was there to collect. Her badge gleamed with 3 letters that dissolved arrogance faster than any K9 bite. DOJ federal oversight had arrived, and it had arrived because of the woman they thought was voiceless. Phones buzzed in every office across the state, attorneys sharpening language, civil rights advocates demanding accountability, journalists replaying the footage in slow motion. The officers inside still clung to a narrative built on sand. She resisted, she threatened, she provoked. But the footage, her silence, and their contradictions told another story. She hadn't needed to fight. She had only needed to endure, to let them incriminate themselves in broad daylight. That was the trap. And now it had sprung. The response began when she was led into the interrogation room again, this time with a different audience. Federal agents sat across from her, not as adversaries, but as witnesses. They asked nothing of her except confirmation. Did the officer order the dog before she moved? Did she resist? Did she threaten? Her answers were measured, steady, wrapped in the clarity that only truth could carry. Each response was a nail in the coffin of their false reports. The officers who had mocked her now avoided her gaze, aware that the woman they'd tried to bury in paperwork had become the witness who could dismantle their careers. The prosecutor who had promised a quiet resolution found himself the one cornered, his name already circulating in the press as complicit in covering police misconduct. He tried to protest, to frame himself as misled, but the federal investigators reminded him of his duty to uphold the law, not shield those who broke it. His words dried in his throat. The sheriff, red-faced and trembling, attempted to reassert control, but the cameras in the hallways had caught him instructing his officers to falsify reports. Loyalty was no longer protection, it was evidence. One by one, his men realized silence would not save them. Some began to talk, desperate to cut deals, eager to step away from a sinking ship. The handler who unleashed the K-9 still wore defiance on his face, but even he knew the ground beneath him was vanishing. The bodycam footage was irrefutable, the live stream undeniable. His authority had been stripped, badge or no badge, and through it all, she never raised her voice. Her presence alone was enough, the embodiment of civil rights defense, the proof that resilience can be sharper than retaliation. The twist was never about revealing a hidden weapon or a sudden outburst of violence. It was about showing that justice, when documented, when carried with patience, becomes a force impossible to silence. The response unfolded in waves. First came suspension notices, delivered with trembling hands. Then came arrests, not of her, but of those who had shackled her. The headlines shifted, from "Local Woman Detained" to "Civil Rights Violation Under Federal Investigation." The nation, watching, found in her a symbol. She hadn't sought it, hadn't asked for it, but she had become it. A reminder that abuse of power thrives only in silence, and silence, when chosen as strategy, can topple even the loudest oppressors. She walked free that evening, not escorted out the back like a suspect, but through the front doors, past the cameras, past the microphones. Reporters shouted questions, but she answered only one. Justice isn't given, it's demanded, and today the demand was heard. Her words traveled faster than the bite of any dog, faster than the lies scribbled on any page. The officers who once laughed now faced hearings, trials, and consequences they had never believed possible. The badge that once protected them now weighed heavily, stripped from their uniforms like rusted armor. The precinct, once a fortress of intimidation, had become evidence in itself. A place remembered not for law and order, but for corruption exposed. The twist was simple, yet devastating. They believed they had caged a woman, but in truth, she had caged them. Her restraint had been her weapon, her silence, the blade. And the response was inevitable. Accountability spreading through every corridor, every office, every report that had once been written without fear. She didn't have to shout to be heard. The nation shouted for her. The courthouse steps were crowded, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across microphones and cameras angled toward her. Reporters surged forward, their questions sharp, their voices hungry, but she stood still, unshaken, as though the chaos had no power over her. The bruises on her wrist, the torn sleeve, the fading mark of the K-9's teeth were visible reminders of what she had endured, yet none of it defined her now. What defined her was the truth that had finally pierced through the wall of lies. The emotional ending wasn't in the arrests alone, nor in the headlines that screamed of police misconduct and civil rights violations. It was the shift of perception. Strangers across the country, watching from living rooms and phones, saw not just a black woman attacked, but a system finally forced into the light. Parents explained to their children why the footage mattered. Teachers discussed accountability in classrooms. Advocates used her case as proof that silence, when strategic, could carry more weight than 1,000 shouted pleas. She walked down the steps, not as a victim, but as a symbol, her every step echoing with the weight of those who had been silenced before her. The officers who once laughed were now facing indictments, their body cam footage dissected by investigators, their names tied not to authority, but to abuse of power. For years, they had relied on the same tactics: false charges, wrongful arrests, intimidation. But the tide had shifted. The nation wasn't looking away this time. For her, the victory wasn't only personal. It was collective. She thought of the countless cases buried under legal jargon, the families who never saw justice because their voices were too easily dismissed. Her story was not just hers. It was a reminder that accountability, though slow, can break through. The moral was clear, etched not just in words, but in action. Power without oversight corrodes, and silence in the face of injustice becomes complicity. Yet silence, chosen as a weapon, can dismantle even the strongest facade. She lifted her head and addressed the crowd, her voice calm but resonant, carrying far beyond the courthouse steps. This is not about one woman in one town. This is about every citizen who has ever been told they didn't matter. Justice isn't a privilege. It's a right. And when that right is denied, we must hold those responsible to account. The words settled over the crowd, not as rhetoric, but as truth. People nodded, some wiped tears, others clenched fists in solidarity. The nation, watching through screens, felt the weight of those words. In living rooms, people whispered that maybe change was possible. In classrooms, students debated what justice meant. In precincts across the country, officers watched with unease, reminded that their badges were not shields against consequence. She turned and walked away, not escorted, not guarded, but free, her steps measured and resolute. The cameras followed until she disappeared into the sunlight, her figure shrinking, but her impact expanding, carried in conversations, in headlines, in the hearts of those who believed in a better tomorrow. The moral ending was not about revenge, but about transformation. It was about proving that even in a world where injustice often wears a uniform, truth has a way of breaking chains. The bite of a dog, the sting of a cuff, the humiliation of wrongful arrest, none of it outweighed the power of exposing abuse of authority for what it was. She hadn't raised her voice, yet she had been heard louder than ever. She hadn't fought with fists, yet she had dismantled an entire facade of invincibility. And for everyone who watched, the lesson was undeniable. Justice is fragile unless protected, accountability is heavy unless demanded, and silence, when sharpened into strategy, can be the most devastating weapon of all.